In this episode, I want to talk about EQ and drums. There's a couple things I think about. One, why EQ? If you've got good mics, do you have to EQ anything? Generally, even with the best mics, there's some tweaking that you do. And part of it is because you're mixing everything together. Your whole mix is not just the drums. Your whole mix is not just the perfect microphone you used on a particular instrument. It's trying to find a balance as you're mixing with all of the elements and carving out space sonically so that all those elements work together and they're transparent, and that the listener, when they're hearing the final piece, can hear everything really clearly, or at least they can hear everything in the way that you intended them to hear that experience. So I think EQ is part of it, and there's a couple of different kinds of types of EQ approaches that I use, and types of EQ that I use. One is shelving, which is actually like sort of blocking frequencies either below a particular frequency or above a particular frequency. It might be a particular frequency band that doesn't really affect the particular instrument that you're on right now. So an example would be on a kick drum, the higher frequencies, like way high, like 10K and above, you're not going to hear much out of a kick drum. That's going to be more like the overhead cymbals in a drum setup. You want that stuff to be kind of shining on top, and the kick drum's kind of fitting in other frequencies. So as far as something that I want to do in the mix is like on this overhead tracks, you barely hear any kick drums. So I'm going to probably shelve out the bottom side of an overhead track. On the kick, I might shelve out the top side, and that way make room for things to sound a little better, a little clearer. Another one is subtractive EQ, and that's when you have frequencies that you think are undesirable, or frequencies that are getting in the way of another instrument. So you want to carve out space. Another type of EQ that I use a lot is additive EQ. What additive EQ is about for me is focusing on particular frequencies or a particular frequency band that is characteristic of whatever the instrument is that I'm zooming in on. For example, on a tom, it could be the tone of the actual note of what the tom is tuned to. And that might be something that I'm going to focus in on so I can bring that out. If it's something that's a little less pitched, like a snare drum, there's certain frequency bands that sort of make it sound beefier or brighter, and I might focus on those for additive EQ. So another area that I really like focusing in on is what I call dynamic EQ. And dynamic EQ is in some plugins like FabFilter Pro Q3, and I'll be showing you an example of some of this stuff in this video. What dynamic EQ allows me to do is pick a particular frequency or frequency band, and then I can, let's say I want to emphasize it, and so I can bump it up a 3 dB. But then let's say I want to emphasize it more if the person who's playing, let's say it's the snare drum track, if they're playing louder, then I might want to pop a particular characteristic frequency up a little more. And the reason for using a dynamic EQ, I'll give you an example. Acoustically, let's pick a trumpet or a trombone, like a brass instrument. When they attack the note really hard with a lot of force, in the room it actually gets brighter. It sounds a little brighter. So there's like a little different frequency kind of coloration that happens when a brass player plays a little bit louder than when they're playing softer. Softer, it tends to be a little darker, a little mellower. And then it gets brighter as they put more energy through the horn. You know, in this idea of using a dynamic EQ, I might want to emphasize that a little bit on a brass instrument so that when they hit it a little harder, that it gets just slightly a little brighter. And it depends on the microphones you use, and you know, some microphones may not bring some of that stuff out, so you might want to help it along using a dynamic EQ. But that's generally the idea of it. So let's get into this, and I'll start showing you systematically kind of what I've set up for Peter's drums, as far as my rough mix and my EQ approach. So let's start with the kick drum. I'm going to start with a couple of different EQ approaches. Let's start with shelving. So I'll do this just so you can visually see it. So right here, I've got a shelf on the high end at 8700 hertz. Within this plugin, you can kind of show how much do you want to shelve off the high frequencies. So like right now, it's 24 decibels per octave, right? And I can actually change that to whatever. If I want it to be a harsher thing, I can change it to 36 decibels an octave. 24 is a common one as far as a shelf on top or even on the bottom. At 8700 hertz, that's where I'm doing this high shelf. On the kick drum, I don't really need the super high frequencies, and like I mentioned earlier in the video, I want to carve out a little bit of room on the high frequencies for the overhead cymbals and things like that. And I'm using two plugins. So Pro Q3 from FabFilter is what I'm using for a lot of the surgical kind of carving out kind of stuff, because you can type in any specific frequency. The other tool that I'm using is the Lindell plugin, the 80 series, which is a simulator of a Neve console, and that's by Plugin Alliance, and I really like that. And part of the reason for using the Neve console strip in my Pro Tools session is to simulate as if we were using a Neve board, and that gives me a particular kind of color, particular kind of sound. So right here is where I'm doing my shelving on this Neve channel strip. And so I've engaged my filtering and my EQ, and basically for my high shelf, I'm just set it at 10K, and then on my low shelf, I actually have it off. And this is a kick drum, and I want to keep all the bottom end on it because what was coming through the microphone sounded really great, and I didn't need to roll off anything. So I want some of the sub, I want all the other kind of characteristics of that kick. So I got my high shelf on the Neve and no low shelf going on at all, right? So that's what's happening on the shelving. Let's look at the subtractive EQ next. So when I look over at the FabFilter, notice you got a couple of points here. So these were frequencies that were just not desirable for the way I wanted the kick to sound, and I thought that improved how the drums sounded overall. So I'm just going to exaggerate these so you can kind of hear them. So I'm just going to play the track now, and then you'll hear it. Right, so those are sort of the three frequencies that I didn't find useful for what I wanted to do. So there's a couple of ways to do it. One, as far as a method, basically you can just, create a point in something like FabFilter and then move it around and listen until you find kind of the one that's like super unattractive as far as frequencies that are getting in the way of a clean mix. And then once you do that, then you've isolated what they are, and then you just roll back until it sounds better to you, until you get to a spot. I did that at all these frequencies, and I just rolled it back until it became something that sounded good to me. And it's all about listening and deciding what sounds good to your ears. On the Neve strip, I didn't do any subtractive EQ. And one of the things I should kind of point out about the Neve strip is it's not as flexible as far as frequencies at all. It's got set frequencies. So for the low EQ, it's just got like 35 hertz, 60 hertz, 110 hertz, and 220 hertz. On the mids up to the highs, it's got 0.36, 0.7K, 1.6K, 3.2K, 4.8, and 7.2. So it's got very specific things. And that's part of the sound of some of these console strips, is that they just have like a notch that's a particular frequency band. And it doesn't show you what the Q is or any of that kind of stuff, so you don't know how wide that curve is. So you just sort of pick it, and then you carve out, either add a little bit of that frequency or subtract a little bit of that frequency. So, if you want something super surgical, then I would use, like in Pro Tools, the default like 7-band EQ is great for that. And there's a lot of videos on YouTube on people showing drum mixes and using that particular plug. So honestly, it doesn't matter what plug it is, as long as you like it. So as I mentioned, there's no subtractive EQ that I'm using on the Neve, but I want to move on to the additive EQ stuff that I'm doing. So I'm going to start with the Neve, and then I'll move over to the Fab Filter. So on the Neve, I've just only added a little bit. So right around 1.6K, I've added about 3 dB. And the reason for that is when that beater hits the kick drum, there's some high frequencies that really help define that impact of the beater. And they kind of sit in that 1K to 1.5K world. And I happen to just like the way it sounded through the Neve strip. So I bumped that up. So if I was to like just play the track so you can hear it, I'm just going to exaggerate it so you can kind of hear it's that particular frequency area. And put it back to what I had before. So as far as additive EQ on the Neve strip, that's the only thing I added, was that 1.6K. As far as additive EQ on the Fab Filter, I'm actually using a dynamic EQ. So the particular frequency area is 341 hertz on the kick drum for this kick drum. And these are not set frequencies. It's not like every kick drum, it's always going to be these frequencies. You really have to listen and then dial things around until you find what you like. In this particular case, this kick drum and this microphone and how things sounded, this sounded the most attractive as far as the really the characteristic kind of frequency of sort of the body of the kick drum for me. And I'll show you what that is by exaggerating this a bit. So you can hear that's the frequency that I thought was really characteristic. I'm going to move it back to its original position. Now the Fab Filter has this dynamic EQ kind of capability. So right now I've just got 1.5 dB a bump on that frequency of 341 hertz. But there's this other little, so that's where you just change your decibel level up or down for your frequencies, right? But there's an outer ring here, right, that allows you to create a dynamic range. And I've pumped it another 3 dB, which means that when he hits the kick drum harder, that frequency is going to pop out just a little bit more. So that creates something that's a little more dynamic as far as the coloration. And that's one of the things that I find like really fun about utilizing dynamic EQ. One of the things you might have noticed when you're looking at the channel strip for the Neve is that there's a gate that's on right here. And I'm going to save the gating conversation for a different episode when I talk about compression. Just because I think that'll fit a little better with that discussion. So I'm going to move forward from the kick to the snare drum. So here's the snare drum, and I've got my Fab Filter EQ here, and then I've got my channel strip for my Neve right here. And I'm not gonna like go through it as detailed, but I just want to point out particular frequencies. So on the snare, there was quite a few little frequencies, like up in the upper mids and the low highs. I've got some frequencies that were kind of getting in the way as far as cymbal related stuff. Like the bell of a cymbal kind of frequency. It was like one of these, and it was on the snare microphone. And it was making the bell pop a little bit too much in the mix. So I pulled some of those kinds of things down in my subtractive EQ. Here's my shelf on the low end, where I kind of have it at 120 hertz, and then I just have a 24 decibels an octave kind of low shelf. On my Neve strip, I've got another low shelf at 70 just to keep pulling that down. And then I've got a high shelf at 14K. So that's my shelving. Let's see. I'm not using any subtractive EQ on the Neve strip. And then as far as additive EQ, I've got just a couple of things. On my filter up top, I've got 12K, and I'm just adding about 4 dB for a little shine on the very top of the snare to brighten it a little bit. And then I'm doing 2 additive EQ frequencies on the Neve at 220 hertz. I'm bumping up that band about 2.5 dB. On the Fab filter, there's a frequency of 189 hertz, which for me on this particular snare was like a good body. So I added a little beef on the bottom, and I just have a slight dynamic EQ on that. So right now I pumped it up 3 dB, but I'm also popping in another dB and a half. So when he hits the snare a little harder, I get a little bit more body. So it's just a very subtle effect, but that's the dynamic EQ that I've got on the snare. So for the overhead cymbals, this is a stereo microphone, and so this is going to affect the whole stereo track. The shelving I've got is, I had a temporary shelf here, but I'm actually just using a shelf at 160 on the low end. Not using anything on the high end because I want those highs on the overhead. So that's my shelving. As far as subtractive EQ, it's all in the Fab filter, and I've sort of picked my frequencies that I wanted to shape. Most of these are very tight cues, where cues like at 40 or 32 or something like that. So it's a very tight range. I have one little band at 1750 hertz that I just dropped back a hair. It was just making things sound a little cleaner when I kind of did, and the cue is like 1.5, so it's a bigger curve. So that's just down just a hair. That added a little more clarity in my mix with the overheads with the other instruments that I've got microphones on for the drum kit. So that's the subtractive stuff. I don't have any additive EQ here. I do have a little bit at 7.2 kilohertz here on the Neve. I got about 4.5 dB that I pumped it up. That's to kind of add a little more shine, a little more the higher frequencies on that. That's what I've got going on in the overheads. Let's look at the hi-hat next, since we just did the cymbals, so I'm going to focus on that. So here's the hi-hat, and hi-hat's fairly simple. What I'm looking for out of this one microphone that's close to the hi-hat, because the overheads have a lot of hi-hat in them, I just want a little more definition from the hi-hat microphone, and that's all I need. It's just a little bit, and the volume on it, I've got it like at minus 15 dB, whereas like the overheads are like -6, snares at -6, kicks at -7. So as far as my track level, it's hovering around -6, but I drop the hi-hat down a lot. So I'm just looking for a little bit of a subtle coloration from the hi-hat microphone, and that's all I need. Everything else is coming from the overheads. So as far as shelving on the Fab filter, I'm doing a low shelf at 300 coming out of the Neve. And the cool thing about this plugin is I can kind of pick. The 8080 series, it has a couple of EQ features that are a little different. If I hit the 84, then I get a couple extra things. I liked the sound of this particular version of the channel strip, and it's just a toggle, which is awesome. So I've got a low shelf at 300 hertz, and then I also have a low shelf at 300 hertz here. So I'm just sort of kind of doubling up. You don't have to do that. You can just pick a low shelf, and it's supposed to just do its trick. So it might be redundant there, but whatever. As far as subtractive EQ, there's no subtractive EQ on the Neve. I've just got a couple of points here. And I think also, like some of the stuff, 7500 hertz, around there, even the 35, probably what it was like the bell of a bride cymbal or something like that. I wanted to just let the overheads do that work and carve it out on the hi-hat. So there's not a whole lot on the subtractive stuff on the hi-hat, just the shelf, and then a couple of frequencies that I wanted to carve back. And then I've got a couple of additive things. There's an additive general filter up top of 4 dB on this version of the channel strip. And then at 7.2, similar to what I did with the cymbals, at 7.2 I bumped it up about 6, almost 6.5 dB. That's what I did there. And it's just salt to taste. When it comes to these frequencies, you find the frequency you like or you don't like. If you don't like it, pull it back. If you like it, maybe bump it up a little bit if that brings out a little more character. And then listen to it, not just isolated like we have here, but listen to it with the whole kit. Listen to it in the whole mix. So it's always this back and forth of zooming in, listening for a particular frequency, and then zooming out, listening to the whole mix, and seeing if it sounds better. I'm just going to play a little bit of the hi-hat track so you can kind of hear it with the EQ. I'm not going to bypass it. There's your hi-hat. And let's move forward to toms. And so I'm starting with just tom 1. So there's tom 1 through 4, high to low. And I mentioned this at the very beginning of the video as an example of an additive EQ. The tom EQ, I've got a separate EQ for each of the 4 toms. So as far as additive, I've got 2 additive EQs. One is not dynamic, it's just a regular additive EQ. And what I'm doing is I'm just picking the fundamental pitch for each of the toms. So tom 1, 189 hertz was the fundamental pitch, and I'm just bumping it up about 3 dB, and that's just giving me a little more tone, and that helps that kind of come through in the overall drum mix a little better. So if I've got it soloed, so if I just play it, you'll hear it. All right, so that's that. If I disable that and play it again, and then try it when I enable it, right? So it gives a little bit more tone. And then around 3900 hertz, that's the characteristic attack. That higher frequency is the attack of the stick hitting the tom. And I want to emphasize that so it adds a little more energy in my mix. So I've just got a dynamic EQ going on here where it's like plus 3 dB initially, but if he smacks it harder, I've got it going up to plus 9 dB, so it's 6 dB more. You know, I'm going to play it disabled so you can hear it. Right, and then let's enable it. And depending on how hard he hits that tom, I can get a little more brightness out of it. The last thing on the fab filter is a subtractive EQ, where I've got around 400 hertz, the mid-range or the low mid-range with the toms. It was getting in the way of the rest of the mix, and you'll notice this on the other toms. I'll show you those as well. I carved out a chunk of that mid-range area because it was just sort of getting in the way. So I just want to emphasize the tone. I carved out a little bit of mid-range to clean it up, and then added a little bit of the attack frequency. That's fab filter. On the Neve console, I don't have any other EQ outside of a shelf at 14K on the high end. That's all I got going on there for tom number 1. And so now I'm going to show you like the other toms. And I'll just do this where I just kind of focus on one plug. So here's fab filter. This is tom 2. So the fundamental pitch was at 141 hertz. And then I carved out about 520 hertz. That was not sounding as good on that tom. And then about 4K was where my attack transient was sounding really interesting. That's what I did on tom 2. On tom 3, my fundamental pitch was 105, but notice how I'm not as tight of a curve. It's a wider curve than my tom 2. And the reason I kind of pick, those are different cues, and the reason I pick different cues is I kind of listen for the band of frequency that sounds the most attractive that I want to emphasize. So if I want to emphasize something in a tighter range, then I make my cue a little tighter. If I want to widen it like we got here in tom 3, there's something a little more interesting about having sort of a bigger band to work with that makes it sound a little cooler, then I go with that. So that's the reason for that. And then, you know, I've carved out about 420 hertz. It's a little more extreme. I dropped it down 9 dB because it was really like getting in the way. There's a lot of ring happening with some of the toms, and it was coloring the overall drum kit sound and making it sound a little less clean. So that's where I carved out a lot of this. And then I've got a little dynamic EQ at 5170 hertz for the transient of the attack. And then on Tom 4, on my Fab filter, 70 hertz is my primary pitch. And then I carved out 450, and then at 4388 hertz, that's that attack transient. And I made that a dynamic. All right, so that's the toms on the Fab filter side. Let's take a look at Tom 2 through 4 on the Neve strip side. There's no EQ similar to Tom 1 except for that 14K high shelf. That's it on Tom 2. On Tom 3, same deal, 14K high shelf, nothing else. And then on Tom 4, same deal, 14K. So I just kept it really consistent there. So that's all the EQ on the toms, and then put the whole kit together. I'm going to play a version without the EQ and then with the EQ. And this is the version with the EQ. So there you have it. That's the EQ episode. And next episode coming up is going to be on compression and gating. See you then.